There are moments on the frontier when kindness becomes a crime, when compassion brands you a traitor, and when doing what feels right in your bones costs you everything you've built. The West was built on codes, unwritten laws carved into the landscape with blood and suspicion, and anyone who crossed those invisible lines found themselves on the wrong side of history. One man learned this truth when he opened his door on a cold November night, an act of simple humanity that would transform him from respected neighbor into outcast, from upstanding citizen into the man whose name people whispered with disgust. What he discovered in those brutal weeks that followed was something the frontier rarely acknowledged. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. Sometimes the greatest courage is found not in violence, but in refusing to let hatred dictate your choices, even when your entire world turns against you for it. This is the story of a man who made one choice, one seemingly small decision, and watched as everything he knew crumbled around him. But it's also the story of what he found in those ashes, something more valuable than approval, something that couldn't be taken away no matter how hard they tried. 12 riders don't show up at a homestead after midnight unless someone's about to die. They come for blood, retribution, or justice, and Jacob Matthews was about to discover which. But let's go back to where it all started. 72 hours earlier, the late autumn wind cut across Jacob's property somewhere between Fort Laramie and the Powder River country when he first heard the knock at his door. At 41, Jacob had spent nearly 20 years carving out his small ranch from unforgiving land, building something solid through backbreaking work and careful dealings with everyone from the fort commanders to the Lakota bands that still controlled most of the territory. But something about that knock, soft and hesitant in the growing darkness, felt different, wrong even. He opened the door to find a young woman, maybe 19 or 20, standing in the November cold. She was Lakota. That much was obvious from her beaded dress and the intricate patterns that marked her as someone of status. But what struck Jacob first was the fear in her eyes and the way she held her left arm tight against her body. Blood seeped through her fingers where she clutched her shoulder. She spoke rapidly in Lakota, words Jacob didn't understand, but the desperation needed no translation. Behind her, the prairie stretched empty and darkening. No horse in sight, no explanation for how she'd come to be alone and injured miles from any known encampment. Jacob knew the smart choice. Every settler within 100 miles knew it. You didn't get involved. You didn't take in wounded Lakota, especially not now. Not with tensions running higher than they'd been in years after the recent skirmishes near the Bozeman Trail. Fort Laramie was 8 miles south. The territorial marshal's office was 12 miles east. There were proper channels, official ways to handle this, ways that wouldn't put a target on your back. But the woman swayed on her feet, and Jacob saw the pallor beneath her brown skin. The way consciousness seemed to be slipping away from her like water through cupped hands. He had maybe minutes to make a choice that he knew, even in that moment, would cost him. He stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. She stumbled across the threshold, and Jacob caught her before she collapsed completely. He guided her to the rough wooden chair near his fireplace and began assessing the wound with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd patched up enough injuries over the years. The bullet had passed through the fleshy part of her shoulder, missing bone, but tearing muscle. She'd lost blood, too much, and infection was already setting in around the edges of the wound. As Jacob heated water and gathered clean cloth, the woman spoke again, softer now, and Jacob caught one word he recognized: Tasunke Witko, Crazy Horse. His hands paused for just a moment. If this woman was connected to Crazy Horse's band, sheltering her wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially suicidal. But the wound needed cleaning. The bleeding needed stopping. These were facts as solid as the earth beneath his feet. And Jacob had never been good at ignoring facts just because they were inconvenient. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound as gently as he could, while the woman gritted her teeth against the pain. When he finished, he gave her water and the last of his dried venison, watching as she ate with the careful slowness of someone who hadn't had food in days. She spoke again, and this time, Jacob heard exhaustion more than fear. He pointed to his bed in the corner, the only real sleeping space in the small cabin. She looked at him with something like confusion, as if kindness from a white settler was so unexpected it didn't make sense. But she was too weak to argue. Within minutes, she was asleep. Jacob sat by his fire through the long night, his rifle across his knees, watching the door and wondering what exactly he'd just brought into his home. He'd know soon enough. In country like this, secrets had a way of traveling faster than horses. Dawn brought Robert Kincaid and 3 other men from the settlement. Jacob saw them coming while the Lakota woman still slept, and he knew immediately why they were there. Kincaid owned the largest spread in the area, a man who'd fought in the Indian Wars and carried those grudges like a second skin. He sat his horse with the rigid posture of someone who'd come not to talk, but to deliver judgment. Jacob stepped out onto his porch, closing the door behind him. The message was clear. Whatever they wanted, they weren't coming inside. Kincaid didn't waste time with pleasantries. Word had reached the settlement about a wounded Lakota woman seen heading toward Jacob's property. Riders had spotted her yesterday evening. Now, here was Kincaid and his men. And the question hanging in the cold morning air was simple. Did Jacob have her? Did he know what he was doing, harboring the enemy? Did he understand what this meant? Jacob met Kincaid's stare without flinching. He had someone injured on his property, he said. He'd given basic medical care, nothing more. As soon as she was stable enough to travel, he'd notify the marshal. Until then, she was under his roof, and that meant she was under his protection. The silence that followed those words felt heavy enough to crush stone. Kincaid's face darkened with something beyond anger, something closer to betrayal. They'd all lived through the same tensions, the same raids, the same fear. And here was Jacob Matthews, someone they'd counted as one of their own, choosing to shelter a Lakota warrior woman instead of doing the right thing. The right thing, Kincaid made clear, was to turn her over immediately. She was probably a scout, maybe even involved in recent attacks on freight wagons. She belonged in custody, not recovering in Jacob's cabin like some honored guest. But Jacob held his ground. She was injured and unarmed. She'd come to him for help, not as a threat. He'd treated her the way he'd treat anyone who showed up at his door bleeding. That was the code he lived by. And it didn't change based on who needed the help. Kincaid leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to something cold and final. Jacob was making a choice, he said. He was choosing sides. And choices like that had consequences. With that, Kincaid and his men turned their horses and rode away, leaving Jacob alone on his porch with the weight of what had just happened settling into his bones. He'd lived in this community for 20 years. He'd helped build the settlement, had stood watch during dangerous times, had earned respect through hard work and straight dealing. And he'd just thrown all of that away for a woman whose name he didn't even know. Inside, he found her awake, sitting up despite the pain it clearly caused. She'd heard everything, Jacob realized. Even if she hadn't understood all the words, she spoke in halting English, surprising him. Her name was Mapia Waste, Cloud Woman. She was the daughter of a chief, though she didn't say which one, and she'd been shot 3 days ago by soldiers who'd attacked a small hunting party. She'd been separated from the others, wounded and alone. And she'd walked for 2 days before finding Jacob's cabin. She understood she'd brought trouble to his door. She would leave. Jacob shook his head. She wasn't strong enough to travel. The wound was still fresh, still vulnerable to infection. She needed at least a few more days of rest and proper food before attempting any kind of journey. Besides, leaving now wouldn't solve anything. The damage was done. The community knew all that was left was seeing it through. Stop for a moment. Jacob is at a crossroads we've all faced in different ways. If you were Jacob, what would you do? Risk everything to help someone your community considers an enemy, or protect yourself and stay silent? I need to know, because here's the truth. Someone watching this right now is facing their own version of this choice. Maybe it's standing up for someone at work when everyone else stays quiet. Maybe it's choosing integrity when dishonesty would be easier. Maybe it's showing kindness when the world tells you to be hard. Your answer might be exactly what someone needs to hear today. Comment below, "I would help because," or "I would protect myself because." There's no wrong answer here, just honest ones. And honest voices change lives. Now, let's see what Jacob decided. The next 2 days passed in uneasy quiet. Jacob continued his work around the property while Mapia Waste rested and slowly regained strength. They communicated in broken English and gestures, and Jacob learned fragments of her story. She spoke of her people's struggle to maintain their way of life as more settlers pushed into their traditional hunting grounds. She talked about the promises made in treaties, promises broken before the ink was dry. She described watching soldiers burn villages, watching children go hungry as the buffalo herds dwindled under systematic slaughter. Jacob listened, and what struck him wasn't the unfamiliarity of her grievances, but how familiar they sounded. Different details, maybe, but the same core injustice he'd seen throughout his life in various forms. The powerful taking from the powerless and calling it progress. On the 3rd day, the 12 riders came. Jacob had been expecting some kind of response, but the size of the group told him this was worse than he'd imagined. Kincaid led them, but now he had the territorial marshal with him, along with several men Jacob recognized as members of the local militia. They didn't come to his door. They surrounded his property, rifles visible, horses arranged in a loose perimeter that made their intent unmistakable. This wasn't a conversation, it was a siege. The marshal called out, his voice carrying across the yard with bureaucratic authority. He had orders to take the Lakota woman into custody, pending investigation of possible involvement in recent hostile actions. He was giving Jacob one chance to comply peacefully, hand her over, or face charges of harboring a fugitive and aiding the enemy. Jacob stepped out onto his porch, Mapia Waste beside him. She'd insisted on standing, on facing whatever came next with dignity, and Jacob hadn't tried to stop her. The marshal's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her beaded dress, the patterns that marked her status, and Jacob saw the moment when the man realized this wasn't just any Lakota woman. This was someone important, someone whose disappearance would have consequences. Jacob spoke clearly, making sure every man there heard him. Mapia Waste had come to his property, seeking medical help for a gunshot wound. She was unarmed. She'd made no threats. She'd done nothing except try to survive after being shot by soldiers While hunting on land guaranteed to her people by treaty, he'd given her basic medical care and shelter, the same he'd give to anyone in similar circumstances. If the marshal wanted to take her into custody, he could try. But Jacob wasn't handing her over voluntarily. The standoff that followed felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in high wind. That moment when you know one wrong move means falling. The militiamen shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. Kincaid's face was tight with fury, but the marshal, to his credit, seemed to recognize the complexity of the situation. He asked Mapia Waste directly if she'd been involved in any attacks on settlers or soldiers. She answered in clear English that she had not, that she was a healer in her band, that she'd been with a small hunting party. Nothing more. The marshal nodded slowly, then asked the question that would determine everything. Would she be willing to come to Fort Laramie voluntarily, to speak with the commanding officer, to help establish the facts of what happened? Mapia Waste looked at Jacob, a question in her eyes, and Jacob understood what she was asking. Could she trust this? Could she believe that walking into Fort Laramie wouldn't mean imprisonment or worse? Jacob couldn't promise that. He had no power over what happened once she left his protection, but he knew keeping her here meant blood. Possibly his, possibly hers, certainly someone's. He met her gaze and spoke the only truth he had. He couldn't guarantee her safety at the fort, but he could guarantee that if shooting started here, people would die, and that wouldn't serve anyone's cause. She nodded, a small gesture of acceptance, and told the marshal she would come willingly, but only if Jacob accompanied her. She wanted a witness, someone who'd seen how she arrived, who could speak to her condition and her conduct. The marshal agreed, though the expression on his face suggested he thought Jacob was a fool for getting more involved than he already was. The group rode out within the hour, Jacob on his horse beside Mapia Waste, the 12 armed men surrounding them like an escort or a prison detail, depending on how you looked at it. Fort Laramie loomed against the autumn sky, a symbol of federal authority in a land that had belonged to the Lakota for generations. The commanding officer, Colonel Hartwell, was a career military man with gray threading through his beard and eyes that had seen too much violence to enjoy it anymore. He interviewed Mapia Waste in his office while Jacob and 2 soldiers stood witness. She told her story with the same calm dignity she'd shown throughout, describing the hunting party, the sudden attack by a cavalry unit that seemed to think any Lakota away from the reservation was automatically hostile, the chaos as they scattered, the bullet that had torn through her shoulder. Hartwell listened, asked pointed questions, and cross-referenced her account with recent patrol reports. What emerged was a picture of confusion and miscommunication, soldiers on edge after rumors of raids, a hunting party in the wrong place at the wrong time, a situation that had spiraled into violence through fear and misunderstanding rather than any actual hostile intent. The hunting party had been legally off reservation, following treaty rights to hunt in unceded territory. The cavalry unit had exceeded its authority in opening fire without clear provocation. The colonel's conclusion came with the weariness of someone tired of the endless cycle. Mapia Waste had broken no laws. She was free to go. However, he strongly recommended she return to her band immediately and avoid any further situations that might be misinterpreted. He would be filing a report about the cavalry unit's conduct, though he made no promises about what consequences, if any, that might bring. As they prepared to leave, Hartwell pulled Jacob aside. What Jacob had done, the colonel said, might have prevented something worse. If Mapia waste had been turned over to the militia, or if violence had erupted at Jacob's property, it could have triggered retaliation from her band. Crazy Horse and Hartwell's expression left no doubt he knew exactly who Mapia Waste's people were. Wasn't known for letting injuries to his relatives go unanswered. Jacob's stubbornness might have saved lives, even if his neighbors would never see it that way. Jacob rode back to his property alone. Mapia Waste had been met by 3 Lakota warriors at the edge of the fort's territory. Men who'd been searching for her since the attack. The reunion had been brief, but charged with emotion. And before she left, she'd spoken to Jacob in careful English. She told him her full name, Mapia Waste, daughter of Tasunke Witko, whom the whites called Crazy Horse. She said her father would know what Jacob had done, that the Lakota did not forget kindness any more than they forgot cruelty. Then she was gone, riding north with her escorts, and Jacob was left to face whatever came next. What came next was isolation. Kincaid and his allies moved quickly to make Jacob's life impossible. Suppliers refused to sell to him. The settlement store turned him away. Men who'd called him neighbor crossed the street to avoid speaking to him. His property became an island, surrounded by hostility and suspicion, and Jacob found himself living in a silence broken only by the wind and his own thoughts. Winter came early and hard that year, and Jacob endured it alone, living off his stored supplies and what game he could hunt. He had time to question his choice, to wonder if standing on principle was worth this price. There were moments, long nights by a fire, that never quite warmed the cabin enough, when doubt crept in like the cold through the gaps in the walls. But spring brought an unexpected thaw, and not just in the weather. Jacob was checking his fence line when he saw them. 6 Lakota warriors riding toward his property. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but something made him stop. They came at a walk, not a charge, and their weapons remained sheathed. As they drew closer, Jacob recognized the lead rider. It was one of the men who'd met Mapia Waste at Fort Laramie. The warrior dismounted and spoke in accented but clear English. He brought a message from Crazy Horse. The great chief knew what Jacob had done for his daughter, how he'd risked everything to help her when he could have turned her away or handed her over to those who meant her harm. This was not forgotten. Crazy Horse wanted Jacob to know that his ranch would be under Lakota protection. No war party from any band would touch his property or his stock in the years of conflict ahead. And the warrior's eyes made clear he knew such years were coming. Jacob's land would be sacred ground, off limits to all sides. The warrior reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a beautifully beaded medicine bag, the intricate patterns marking it as a gift of high honor. Inside, he said, were items blessed by their holy men, symbols of protection and respect. Then the warriors mounted and rode away, leaving Jacob standing in his yard with tears streaming down his weathered face, understanding finally that some things mattered more than acceptance. Some choices created bonds stronger than any built on fear or hate. If stories like this touch you, if they make you think about courage and choices in your own life, this channel is exactly for you. Click the subscribe button to join a community that believes character matters more than comfort. We share a new story every week that will challenge you, inspire you, and remind you what true strength really means. Jacob Matthews had given shelter for one night. In return, he found something he hadn't known he was searching for, a way to live with honor, even when it cost him everything. A peace that came from knowing he'd chosen humanity over tribalism when it mattered most. His ranch remained isolated from the settlement for the rest of his days. But it was never truly alone. Over the years that followed, as tensions escalated into open warfare, as the Lakota fought their losing battle against encroachment and broken treaties, Jacob's property remained untouched, a small island of peace in a sea of violence. The settlement eventually forgot why they'd shunned him, though the older residents never fully welcomed him back. But Jacob had learned that approval was a poor substitute for integrity, that the opinions of fearful men mattered less than the knowledge that when tested, when the moment came to choose between what was easy and what was right, he'd chosen right. The choice had been simple, the consequences had been hard, but he would make the same choice again if asked. That was enough. If you enjoyed this story, click on the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and choices shape destinies in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider donating in Super Chat to help us keep bringing more stories like this. Your support means the world to us.